Hello. I'd just like to pay my respects before I start to David Turner. David, many of you will know. David was a huge influence on the board of the European Federation of Therapeutic Communities, and I know that he was incredibly important to the Vienna Committee. And much of what I'm going to talk about comes from a whole series of long conversations that David and I had about the relationship between addiction theory and treatment practice and how we could develop recovery communities. So some of this is David's work rather than mine. And David died a few months ago. So if there's bits of this you don't like, they were David's. Does that translate? No, it was a joke. Okay, so this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to very, very briefly talk about addiction theory and the biopsychosocial model. I'm going to talk about how that fits with treatment practice. And in this instance, I'm going to use therapeutic communities as an example. Elisa gave a very good presentation this morning explaining the basic principles of TCs. That's the treatment practice I know best, so I'm going to use that. Then I'm going to talk about what recovery capital is and how we might build recovery communities. So here's two quotations. One is from the author of Spirit Level, Richard Wilkinson. It's hard to tell the difference between maps of crime, ill health, drug addiction, or low educational achievement. They all look like maps of poverty. And I think you need to bear in mind that poor options and low educational attainment do not create addiction, but addiction does flourish in those conditions. And this is my favorite quote. This is from Charles Deirdrich, the founder of Synanon, the first therapeutic community, in a conversation with Abraham Maslow. And Deirdrich said, "Synanon is not a drug treatment. It's a school where people learn to live right, and stopping shooting dope is just a side effect." Keep that in mind. We need to get away from the idea that treatment is simply about medicine. This is not a medical problem. This is a social problem with medical elements. Okay, so here we go. I'm really not going to spend much time on. If you want to read the paper that is associated with this, please let me know. I've got a copy of the paper. It goes into a huge amount of detail about these. The thing to remember about addiction policies, theories, two things. Remember two things. One is they always are reflective of the period within which they are developed. And the second is that unlike software, they don't get replaced by version 2. Okay, so you don't get a new addiction theory and everything else is wiped out. So what we end up with is a horrible mess of bits of the moral theory, bits of the disease theory, bits of the characterological theory, and so on. Now, in the early 1970s, along came the biopsychosocial model. And the main proponent of this is really Norman Zimberg, who wrote Drug Set and Setting. And basically what Zimberg said, if we want to understand addiction, we need to recognize that it has three key elements. The first key element is the drug itself. We need to understand that there will be a physical component to this experience, to this phenomenon, that people will be physically addicted. There may be a genetic component. People may be genetically predisposed to become addicted. There will be parallel disorders. We know that if you look at treatment populations, you find very, very high levels of PTSD as a result of childhood sexual abuse. We know that we see very high levels of dyslexia, ADHD, bipolar disorder, and so on. So it's rarely going to be on its own, and there will be other physical, cognitive issues that need to be dealt with and managed. The second is the set. That's how people see themselves, how comfortable they feel about themselves, what they think people say about them when they walk out of the room, their self-belief. Because we know that people's self-belief and people's belief in their ability to achieve and overcome is absolutely crucial in recovery. And the final thing is setting. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. People get addicted to drugs in areas where drug addiction seems normal, where it seems the only option. There are issues like homelessness, like poor family relationships, like poor social networks, like low unemployment. That's the setting. All of these three combine to create the addictive experience. Now, if that's true, then what we do in treatment needs to reflect that. And it needs to reflect it evenly. So we need to work on the drug, the set, and the setting all at the same time. Because if we don't, we get an imbalance. So let me give you two examples of imbalance. I take a homeless heroin addict, and my response to his problem is that I put him in a brand new apartment in the city centre. Will that work? No. Because all I've done is altered the setting. I've not done anything about how he sees himself, how he believes in himself. I've not done anything about his physical problems. I've just altered the setting. I think I can fairly guarantee that the refrigerator from that apartment will be in a second-hand shop by the end of the week. Okay? Second example. I get a similar drug user. What do? I put him on a methadone prescription, and that's it. I don't do anything about how he sees himself. I don't do anything about his social network or his unemployment. And guess what? After a while on methadone, he thinks, oh, I could probably cut this down and have a drug-free life. And guess what? Because nothing else has changed, that's going to be a failure. So we have to do all three at once. So, a good service will reduce or eliminate drug use and develop skills for managing craving. It will improve self-esteem, encourage resilience, and support efforts to assist the recovery of others. It'll change the setting, so it'll encourage changed environments, changed communities, new activities, being involved in different things. In my view, the therapeutic community is probably the only treatment service that systematically involves all three of these. But I would say that, wouldn't I? So in a therapeutic community, the whole structure, it teaches impulse control, and it teaches it within a safe setting. Complete withdrawals managed, and normal sleep patterns are re-established. I've talked to many, many residents who tell me that they didn't start sleeping properly until 4 months into the program. Physical health is systematically improved. We get our teeth fixed. We get the health problems resolved. We check from HIV and Hep C and so on. And parallel disorders are explored and managed. I said earlier, probably about 50% will be dyslexic. There are ways that we can help people with dyslexia, help them to manage it. We can't cure it, but we can help them to manage it. In terms of this set, a therapeutic community explores individuals' feelings of self-worth. It challenges poor behavior, encourages good behavior. It encourages the support for recovery of other members There's a TC saying that you can't keep it unless you give it away. And people get increasing levels of responsibility as they show that they're capable of behaving in a different way. So we encourage changes in behavior and personality and self-esteem. And finally, we encourage new positive relationships. We encourage the repair of relationships that have been damaged with perhaps parents or wives, husbands. We teach new vocational and employability skills. And the whole process is deliberately designed to create positive citizenship. So that's how a service might take those three principles from Zimberg and turn them into treatment areas. Recovery capital was developed by a guy called Hanifan, a schools inspector, in the 1920s. Foucault obviously has developed this idea. The idea of social capital is that it's a non-depleting resource, that actually the more you use it, the more it recreates itself. This is not about money. This is about the resources that people have, the connections that people have with each other and the world around them. There's a lovely quote here from David Best and Alexandra Lode. Although the focus here is primarily on individual factors, it's the meshing of these three components, social, human, and cultural capital, that may be particularly important in assessing recovery capital at a group or social level. So we need to develop people's recovery capital. In simple terms, if you think of drug set and setting as three big jars, you need to increase the amount of liquid or beans or whatever it is in each of those jars, and that will ensure recovery. So, what does all that mean in terms of building recovery communities? Well, the first thing is, I think we need to start by proactively countering the whole mythology about the incurable disease. And sadly, one of the problems that I think we have, and I'm going to make a lot of enemies now with this next statement, but the two main partners in the treatment field in Europe today are the mutual aid fellowships like AA and Narcotics Anonymous, and methadone prescribing services. And sadly, both of them say precisely the same thing. AA and NA say you have an incurable disease, it cannot be resolved, the best we can do is to manage it, and you will manage it by just keeping on attending meetings every week and every day if you need to. And methadone prescribing says, you have an incurable disease, the best we can do is manage it by keeping on taking this medication every day, every day, every day. And both of them are saying, this is an incurable disease. This is not an incurable disease. I stopped using heroin 43 years ago. There's hundreds of us, thousands of us. It's not incurable, and we need to get that message across. And the reason we need to get that message across is that's the only way that we will reduce the stigma that surrounds recovery. Because the reason for stigma is the belief in an incurable disease. I don't want you as an ex-heroin addict living next to me, because sooner or later you will fail and come round and you'll eat my babies. And I don't want to employ you as an ex-alcoholic, because sooner or later you'll get drunk on the job and someone will get killed. How do I know this? Because you have an incurable disease. Who told me that? All those treatment services. So we need to counter that and start changing that fundamental position. Somebody's phone's ringing. Get it? It might be important. Okay. So if we can reduce stigma by making recovery more visible, then we can encourage recovery. Now, some of the things that we might do in terms of that is we can begin to encourage people in recovery to become recovery champions, to celebrate their recovery. We can do more in treatment services to celebrate the recovery of people who come through our services. We can be more visible. So, we want to encourage recovery addicts to engage in treatment. Quite often people will go into prescribing services. They'll never see anyone who came out the other end. We can encourage addicts to come back. As part of the payment for their treatment, they come back and encourage others. They become role models and mentors. We can promote recovery events, concerts, marches, and so on. In Manchester, in England, 2 weeks ago, there was a huge march of 8,000 people in recovery from alcohol and drugs, marched through the street, met with a speech by the Lord Mayor of Manchester. Those kind of events are hugely important and hugely significant. How am I doing for time? I bet I'm over time, aren't I? Okay. We can start seeing people in recovery as assets. We've spent the last 50 years seeing people in recovery as liabilities, things that will go wrong. Let's start to see people in recovery as assets. The reason why all of this is important, we could also establish some Oxford houses, sober living houses. We can establish businesses in communities that are recovery friendly, dry bars, fruit bars, so on. And the reason why all of this is important, and there is no slide for this, so I'm just going to say it. There is no slide because I forgot to put the slide in. I apologize. One of the really interesting things is if you look at the worldwide evidence on the development of children of parents who have been addicted or who are currently addicted and the general population, one of the things that really stands out is that the children of people who are in active recovery, people who have stopped using and are living their lives, those children do better than the norm. Okay? They actually do better than children from families where there's never been a drug or alcohol problem. And the reason for that is if you spend all that time filling up those 3 jars, that's the kind of process you need to go through to change yourself to become a better parent. So you will become a better parent. We've talked a lot about the cost of addiction in the last couple of days. The real cost of addiction is intergenerational transmission. Talk to any drug worker you know, they will tell you that they never see a drug user without there being some kind of addiction further up the family tree. Dad was an alcoholic, granddad was an alcoholic, and so on. It's passed down through the generations. If we want to create a firewall between this generation and the next and grow up a generation of non-addicted kids, then the way we do it is to encourage recovery and encourage recovery champions and encourage the development of recovery communities. Thank you.